Welcome to The Explainer, everyone. I am absolutely thrilled to have you all here today because, quite frankly, we are tackling one of the most fascinating, complex political transformations of the entire 20th century. You know, when we think about the 1979 Iranian Revolution, our minds usually go straight to those massive street protests, right? The chanting crowds, the sudden fall of the Shah. But here is the central thesis we're going to be exploring today. That grueling, devastating Iran-Iraq war that kicked off almost immediately afterward, it didn't interrupt the 1979 revolution. It actually completed it. That conflict was literally the crucible that forged the modern Islamic Republic. It took this incredibly fragile ideological blueprint and hammered it into a hardened military-industrial reality. So today, we are going to unpack exactly how this young state survived against all odds and permanently institutionalized itself. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. We're going to start by looking at the guardianship of the jurist, then move through the internal contest for power and the hostage crisis. After that, we'll get into the Iran-Iraq War itself, explore how that war completed the revolution, and finally, we'll wrap up with the lasting legacy of sacred defense. Section 1. Guardianship of the jurist. So, to really understand this state, we absolutely have to understand its architect. Scholar Michael Axworthy points out something crucial. During his 14 years in exile, mostly spent in the Iraqi shrine city of Najaf, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini wasn't just sitting around waiting out his banishment. No, he was actively developing a radical new theory of governance. He was creating a guiding principle that would allow the clergy to govern completely in their own right, without ever having to defer to secular politicians. And that brings us to the absolute foundational doctrine of the new state, Velayat e Faqih. It translates to the guardianship, or the authority, of the Islamic jurist. Now, the logic here was actually pretty profound. Since the 9th century, Shia Islam has awaited the return of the hidden imam. But Khomeini argued, hey, in the imam's absence, society shouldn't just descend into chaos, and it definitely shouldn't be ruled by illegitimate secular kings. Instead, supreme, unquestionable authority over the state should be placed directly in the hands of a deputy, someone who deeply, fundamentally understands divine law. Khomeini was incredibly straightforward about this. As he bluntly put it in his lectures, Islamic government may be defined as the rule of divine law over men. I mean, that is a total, ground-up rejection of secular authority. He threw out the old 1906 Iranian constitution, which he felt was completely tainted by foreign imperialism. He wasn't interested in setting up a traditional republic where laws change based on the shifting opinions of voters. He wanted a system governed strictly, from top to bottom, by Islamic law, the Sharia, derived straight from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. Okay, so that begs the question, who exactly gets to wield this immense amount of power? Well, that would be the faquhi, or in the plural, fuqaha. These are the top-tier experts in Islamic law. Khomeini's argument was simple but revolutionary. If the primary purpose of the government is to implement divine law, then obviously the only logical people to lead that government are the scholars who have spent their lives studying that exact law. They were intended to hold the reins of this entire new government machinery. They would sit high above any elected president or parliament, basically acting as the ultimate umpires to ensure that every single piece of legislation aligned perfectly with religious edicts. Section 2. Internal contest for power. Now, having a brilliant blueprint on paper is one thing, but actually implementing it, that is a whole different ballgame. And this brilliantly illustrates just how chaotic the 18 months following the February 1979 victory really were. The new regime almost immediately faced existential threats, and not just from the outside, but from within the very coalition that it just brought the revolution to power in the first place. Historian Abbas Amanat maps out this incredibly fierce domestic battlefield for us. On one side, you've got the Homenist hardliners, organized under the Islamic Republican Party and led by powerful figures like Mohammad Beheshti. On the other side, their former revolutionary allies. You had the first selected president, Abu Hassan Badani Sadr, you had the liberal Islamists, and you had a highly organized Marxist Islamic group known as the Mojahedin Khalq, or MKO for short. Think about how incompatible these groups were. The liberals wanted a democratic republic, the MKO wanted a classless Marxist society, and the Homenists wanted their divine state. A massive clash was absolutely inevitable. And this factional rivalry for sure didn't stay politely confined to the realm of political debate. It violently spilled right out into the streets. Pro-regime militias, who were soon labeled Hezbollahis, or the Party of God, literally armed themselves with sticks and clubs to clash with the armed cadres of the Mojahedin Khalq. The Khomeinists began systematically purging all opposition from the political process. Feeling completely pushed out and cornered, the well-organized MKO made a really deadly miscalculation. They launched an armed insurgency. What followed was a brutal reality of bloody street battles, devastating targeted assassinations of high-ranking clerics, and ultimately, thousands of arrests and executions as the new state ruthlessly consolidated its grip on power. Section 3. The hostage crisis. Right in the middle of all this intense domestic turmoil, the fragile new republic faced its first major international crisis. And this was an event that would fundamentally alter its trajectory forever. In November 1979, revolutionary students stormed and took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, holding diplomats hostage for nearly 15 months. Now, scholar Abbas Amanat makes a really vital point here that we can't overlook. This crisis wasn't just a foreign policy disaster. Domestically, it acted as a massive strategic propaganda victory for the hardliners. By framing the United States as the Great Satan, the Khomeinists successfully rallied the Iranian public behind them. Even more importantly, the crisis directly forced the resignation of the liberal provisional government because they simply couldn't control the radical students. The hardliners basically weaponized this intense anti-imperialist fervor to permanently sideline the liberal Islamists and lock down their own control over all that volatile revolutionary energy. Section 4. The Iran-Iraq War. So by September 1980, Iran is deeply isolated on the world stage due to the hostage crisis, and its military is thoroughly fractured from all those revolutionary purges. Seeing this incredibly vulnerable, chaotic neighbor next door, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein decided to strike. He launched a massive, full-scale military invasion across a broad front. When you look at the physical geography of the region, you see how Iraqi forces moved swiftly into Iran's oil-rich southwestern province of Khuzestan, quickly capturing the vital port city of Khorramshahr. This rapid thrust took the young, isolated Islamic Republic completely by surprise. Saddam was really hoping to deal a quick, surgical blow. He wanted to punish Iran, maybe even dismember the country a bit. But most of all, he wanted to prevent Khomeini's radical brand of revolutionary Shiism from spreading across the border and infecting Iraq. But as we know, the war definitely did not end quickly. Scholar Vali Nasser breaks this conflict down into a really helpful, though grueling, chronological framework for us. The first phase, from 1980 to 1982, was defined entirely by the initial Iraqi invasion and occupation. But by 1982, against all conventional odds, Iranian forces actually managed to push the Iraqis back out. That leads us right into the second phase, from 1982 to 1986, where Iran made the highly fateful decision to push the war into Iraqi territory. And finally, the third phase, from 1986 to 1988, where the war devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate that only ended when Iraq successfully pushed back into Iranian territory. It dragged on to become one of the longest, deadliest conventional wars of the entire 20th century. So, what does this all mean? Why did it last so incredibly long? Well, it all comes down to this strict strategic directive from Ruhollah Khomeini. He declared Saddam was a corrupt aggressor and Iran would not negotiate. Iran would fight until it won, even if it took 20 years. Khomeini brilliantly and ruthlessly transformed this conflict from a simple dispute over a border into a total existential war of ideological survival. To the revolutionary leadership, securing their physical borders literally meant securing the revolution itself. In their eyes, there could be absolutely no compromise with an aggressor backed by global imperialist powers who just wanted to see the Islamic Republic fail. Section 5. War completes the revolution. And this brings us right back to our main thesis. The Iran-Iraq War was not some unfortunate interruption to their state-building process. It was the defining catalyst. It permanently hardened the state's institutions and completely wiped out any remaining internal opposition. To really grasp this, scholars often look to sociologist Charles Tilly's famous dictum, "War made the state." Think about it. Just like how foreign invasions during the French Revolution empowered the radical Jacobins to seize absolute control, the Iraqi invasion empowered Iran's radical clerics. The absolute, undeniable necessity of total military mobilization gave the government the ultimate justification. They could silence all dissent, demand strict ideological conformity, and rapidly build up the powerful military institutions that still run the country today. One of the absolute most important institutions born out of this wartime crucible is the Basij. Initially, this started out as a volunteer mobilization militia sent to the front lines. It was often made up of very young boys and old men who were motivated by sheer ideological zeal to do things like clear minefields with their own bodies. But Khomeini realized pretty quickly that he needed an ideologically pure force, not just for the physical borders, but to protect the regime from internal enemies. So over time, the Basij evolved. It became this massive, pervasive mechanism for internal social control, actively safeguarding the clerical establishment across universities, workplaces, and local neighborhoods. But even more critical to the state's ultimate survival was the phenomenal rise of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or the IRGC. Now, before the war, they were really just a scrappy guerrilla militia. They were created mostly just to counterbalance the regular national army, which the clerics still didn't fully trust because of its old ties to the Shah. The brutal reality of the battlefield, however, forged the IRGC into a full-fledged, highly regimented military force. They evolved into the clergy's elite Praetorian Guard. They were suddenly entrusted with a dual mission: the external defense of the state and the absolute, uncompromising preservation of its revolutionary ideology. Section 6. Legacy of Sacred Defense. When the war finally ended in 1988, in a devastating stalemate, leaving hundreds of thousands dead and the economy completely shattered, the ruling elite still somehow viewed the survival of the Islamic Republic as this massive divine victory. That combination of immense trauma and eventual triumph fundamentally rewired Iran's long-term grand strategy. It birthed an entirely new political class of war veterans who firmly believed that international laws and norms were never going to protect them. The only thing that could? Complete self-reliance. This created the concept of the Maidan, which translates to the battlefield. It is a prevailing strategic mentality in Iran today that deeply privileges military veterans, security forces, and the IRGC over traditional civilian diplomats when it comes to shaping foreign policy. Now, what's really interesting about this transition is the sheer scale of the transformation. It is staggering. Look at the contrast here. Before 1980, Iran had a heavily fragmented military. They had this extreme reliance on Western arms that they could no longer even acquire, and they had crippling internal factionalism threatening to tear the whole state apart. By the end of the war in 1988, they had forged this remarkably dominant IRGC and besieged structure. They developed a fierce doctrine of self-reliance that eventually birthed their massive domestic missile and drone programs, and they created that unified Maidan security culture we just talked about. The war quite literally built the modern Iranian military-industrial state from the ground up. And because Iran couldn't easily acquire advanced conventional weapons during those war years, scholars Ariana Tabatabai and Annie Tracy Samuel explain that the country adopted a highly distinct strategy of defensive realism. Basically, since they knew they couldn't win a standard conventional war against heavily armed Western-backed adversaries, they strategically shifted gears. They pivoted to unconventional warfare. This meant relying heavily on asymmetrical regional strategies and actively cultivating proxy militias, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, to fight conflicts far away from Iran's actual physical borders. It's a comprehensive grand strategy of forward defense, and it was born entirely out of the desperate, bloody lessons they learned in the 1980s. This entire post-war worldview is summed up just perfectly by Iran's current supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He states, "The lesson of sacred defense is that national security is ensured by resistance alone. The traumatic isolation, the total lack of international support, the immense human sacrifices of the 1980s, all of it permanently infused Iran's economy and politics with this core value. For the state's leadership, resilience and perpetual resistance aren't just empty political buzzwords to throw around on TV. They are the literal, proven mechanisms of their historical survival." Which brings us to the most crucial question for anyone studying the geopolitics of this region today. If the Iran-Iraq War forged the modern Islamic Republic's institutions, and if it completely dictated its survival strategy, how exactly will a state built entirely on the doctrine of perpetual resistance and wartime sacrifice navigate a future where the original generation of revolutionaries and the living memory of the war itself is fading away? It is a massive systemic challenge, and it's something I want you all to think critically about as you continue your studies. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and keep asking those big questions.